to Sprint 117 review. I'll go over the sprint statistics. Carol will do the community update. Harpreet on UI, Adam on providers, Joe V on platform, Alberto API, Mike on QE, and Suyog on documentation. We had 314 PRs merged, and you can see we just came down a little bit. These are the top 3 repos that have PRs merged. We'll go to the next slide. And here again, we had more PRs merged this sprint, which was a good thing. And here are the PRs by label. Nice, pretty colors. And for the health report, so there's a lot more churn a little bit this sprint, and apparently that was because we deleted a lot of old refresh code. So that is why you're seeing a lot of reds and greens, but there's nothing here that sticks out too much. And over to Carol.
Thank you, John. So for the community update, we have quite a few items. ManageIQ VLcek beta 1, the first beta release is available now. So check it out. And with that, we have we need a new name for the upcoming J release. So there are some candidates for the new name, and you can check out the blog post, as well as vote on the talk forum. So the poll is on the forum, and please vote by this Friday, which is in 2 days. And we will announce the results next week. So with the upcoming release, the user documentation has also been updated, and now it's built and generated on the website. So it's been added to the ManageIQ website. And last weekend, we had an event, DevConf India in Bangalore. And I want to give a big thanks to Satyajit for helping with all the planning for the ManageIQ booth, demos, staffing and everything, and coordinating most of the stuff from his side. And of course, also to Iman, Kushbu, and Rahul for tirelessly talking and demoing stuff at the booth to lots of people. This very successful event, lots of interest. And if you want to take a look at some moments and pictures from the event, I've put together a Twitter moment, and the link is there. Okay, that's all for this sprint. Thanks, and next slide, please.
Hi, everyone. Total 86 PRs merged across all of the UI repos. Out of that, there were 6 enhancements, 45 bug fixes, and so on. There were few small enhancements and a lot of bug fixes made during the sprint. I have some of the main ones highlighted here. So for enhancement, styling was applied to the filtered saved reports view. If you have any styling applied to your reports prior to this PR, when viewing saved reports, all rows were showing up in plain black text, but now with this PR, you can see pretty colors and styling in the rows that was selected when creating a report. So for the next one, service dialog form, that's the React component, was changed to be generic form, so it can be reused by other screens as we continue to convert forms to use React. In Dialog Editor, when adding a new tab, it did not make sense to create an empty tab, so changes were made to add a new section when a tab was added. That makes it easier to drag and drop new dialog fields right after creating a new tab. And on V2V side, on authentication step of conversion host wizard, transformation method field previously had no default value set. So that was changed to have VDDK as a default value. And that makes VDDK library path field visible by default when the user first visits the step. Also on the V2V side, on the last step of migration wizard, back and cancel buttons were removed, as those always remained disabled and were confusing because a user could not really go back from that step of the wizard. So now you can only see close button on that last step. Next slide, please. And for the bug fixes, a fix was made to only show graph hybrid tabular view toolbars on the saved report view when applicable. A fix was made in Reports Explorer in some edge cases when switching accordions in the Report Explorer, correct contents were not loaded in the right cell. So a couple of PRs were made to fix the issue completely. On edit collect logs in Configuration Explorer, once a log collection setting was added, there was no way to remove the configured setting. So an option no depot was added to the dropdown to fix the issue. An issue was fixed on policy simulation screen when pressing a back button from simulation results screen. It was not showing all the selected items in the list on the initial screen, so that got fixed. And a bug was fixed on the user role features screen. When a role had access to everything, some of the features were still not included and were marked as checked on the tree, so that got fixed. And an infinite spinner issue was fixed on catalog items delete modal that was caused when multiple items were selected to delete and user pressed delete button too quickly. Change was made to show delete button as disabled until API call finishes fetching and loading data on the modal. And a couple of bugs fixed in the advanced search area. One of them was to clear the modal after user presses apply button, even though the results were loaded in the background, but the advanced search modal was still on top of the screen. So that got fixed, and another bug in the same area was fixed when apply button was pressed, was also sending up a transaction to the cancel button, and this was causing random issues at times depending upon which order the transactions were being sent. So now when apply button is pressed, only apply transaction goes up. And that's all I have for the UI. Next slide, please. On to Adam.
Thanks, Harpreet. So it was a pretty busy sprint for providers. After we cut the Ivanchuk branch, I went on a cleaning spree and deleted a whole bunch of old refresh code. So a lot of providers had both with the ability to be able to switch back to the older refresh style in case there were any bugs found. For the most part, graph refresh has been the default for many releases, and we've never had an occasion where we'd have to go back in settings and be able to turn it off. So previously we had removed the option of disabling it, and now we've actually deleted a lot of the old code, which is why you see a lot of the change in the repo statistics. So some interesting things found from that slide, like a couple providers had way better test coverage for graph refresh, and some had way better test coverage for classic refresh. So now that we've gotten that all standardized, we can go through and make sure that they're all up to standards. So those are the repos which I deleted the graph or the classic refresh for. Some outstanding ones are OpenShift and Kubernetes because they didn't really follow the same pattern that the rest of them did, and I have to do some special things on those to get that to only do graph refresh. VMware vCloud didn't have a graph refresh parser for the network manager, so we need to write one in order to delete the old code. And VMware is still primarily using classic refresh, but I'm hoping to turn that on to graph refresh by default in the next sprint. So just generally remove the number of settings that the user has to deal with. There are fewer knobs to turn in the settings. It just should work the way it is. And obviously removed a large amount of code. Then also on core, I cleaned up a couple of small issues to the inventory persister. One of them was some old attributes were being set that were never being used, and so it was just adding extra confusion. And the other one, there are a couple of attributes that were buried in a mix-in, but those are being overridden by child classes, and so it wasn't obvious where those methods were coming from, and so I moved that back up into the base class. On the OpenStack side, Merrick fixed a bug with block device mapping in snapshot, so it turned out that when it was doing targeted refresh of a snapshot, it was possibly returning an array, and we weren't handling that, and so we fixed that up. Next slide. On the Amazon side, Alex Z added a support feature mixin for assume role, which is currently only supported by Amazon, but this is another type of authentication. If you don't want to give an access key and a secret key, there's another type of authentication that they call assume role, which is essentially allows you to more granularly define the different permissions that you want to give to the role. And it also allows you to give permissions only to a subset of instances, which is not possible with access key and secret key. So you could say, I only want this instance in Amazon to be able to assume this role. For overt, they fixed an issue where connecting to the overt metrics database failed. This is when we upgraded to the newer PG gem to be able to use Postgres 10. It turned out that the overt metrics code was relying on an older version of the PG gem. And so what we did was we deleted the old legacy Postgres connector. It was there because older versions of Rev use really old versions of Postgres like 8.x, and Rails had removed support for those, and so we had to maintain a bunch of old code to be able to connect to those. Since that's happened, we've moved on to only support versions of Rev which use supported versions of Postgres, so it turned out that we could actually completely delete the old legacy adapter, which was actually really nice because it was like thousands of lines of old code that nobody really paid attention to anymore. On the Redfish side, the XLab guys added support for adding firmware or creating firmware registries with all of their associated endpoints and authentications, all part of one nice method. So it reduced the amount of methods and API calls that had to be done to create a firmware registry. Next slide. And we've got a lot of VMware stuff going on. So David added support for building the full URL for a remote console. Before it was just returning the ticket number, and it was up to the UI to build the URL based on the host that the VM was on and the ticket. And so now, since this logic is VMware specific, it's now in the VMware repo and is more consistent with what OpenStack was doing, where it returned the URL as part of the response for that. And so hopefully in the next sprint, they'll be able to remove that from the UI. I cleaned up the refresh worker do before work loop, which was setting up the collector, but it turned out that the next method was going to start the collector anyway, so we got to clean that up. I also made changes to let the refresh worker queue the initial refresh instead of the broker, which is more in line with what all the other providers do. The reason this is different in VMware is because we would restart the refresh workers every 2 hours, and if the refresh workers start up queue to refresh, it would essentially be doing way more full refreshes than otherwise required. And so I think it was the last sprint or 2 sprints ago, we removed that logic, and so we no longer restart the refresh workers automatically. So now we can go back to letting this be more standard. And this, in combination with the previous PR, let us completely remove the override of the do before work loop from VMware, so it's a lot more consistent with the rest of the providers. I added tests for all of the streaming refresh targets. So for classic refresh, and actually all refresh aside from VMware, it's pretty constrained what types of refresh targets you can have, and it's typically just the VM or the host. For streaming refresh for VMware, essentially every collection could be a targeted refresh, and so there was not a lot of test coverage for the targets other than VM or host. So was going through and testing a few others like data center, folder, data store, etc., switch. And out of that, most of them worked, but I found 2 bugs out of that, and so we fixed those 2. One was for data store. If you did a targeted refresh of that, it would clear all the other host mappings. And the other one was, I think, also related to data stores. We had some really funny modeling with data stores and storages, and so a lot of bugs ended up coming out of that. And we also simplified provisioning of VM. After you provision a VM, we have to find it in the database, and we were doing a kind of interesting method of adding a unique ID to the VM notes, and then later on doing a find on the entire database, not just on the EMS, on the whole database, looking for VMs with the same name that then had that UID in the notes. Not sure why we do that, and it was pretty inefficient and slow. So now what we do is we get the EMS ref back when you first clone. So when you say, I want to clone the VM, it returns you a task, and that task has the new VM's EMS ref in it. And so we can essentially just say, try to find the EMS ref in the database, which is way more standard and a lot faster. Next slide. And VMware continued. I don't think we've ever had 2 slides for VMware. Drew finished up a lot of work. I'm not sure why it took so long, but added the ability to select eager scrub on a disk, which I believe was added in 5.0, and it was genuinely a lot of work, and so it was a great feature to get in. It turned out that we had to refactor the disk relocate options. We're using a deprecated method that didn't support the new option of setting eager scrub. So in addition to that, and in addition to finding out that we don't automatically add new settings to the Vim broker, and so it was silently dropping all of her work, and nobody noticed until Greg M was like, hey, I wonder if this is why, and it turned out that's why. So she had to add that new disk relocate spec locator to the Vim broker to be able to do that, refactor how we're setting the thin provisioned options, and then in addition to that, set the eager 0 option. So now the options when you're cloning a VM for the existing disks, you can either set thin, thick, lazy zeroed, or thick, eagerly zeroed. And she also added a note just letting people know that if you do intend to zero out an entire disk, it does take quite a long time. And I think that's finally it for providers.
Phew, that was a lot, Adam. So in the platform space, there were 21 PRs merged in this sprint. Starting with bugs, Yuri fixed one that prevented the EVM server from starting after a migration due to some renaming that had happened. Brandon addressed an issue where the MIQ server GUID was blank. And Joar fixed the bug. Well, he didn't fix the bug. What he did was he made it possible for Overt to implement their own PG version check, which will allow Overt to fix a cap and U failure bug. Nick C addressed quite a few bugs. He fixed a typo in Ansible config that had prevented the playbook from finding the ship role. He added some status check instance methods in the MIQ task class to address a bug that prevented some Ansible jobs from launching. He addressed an issue where the server's my zone was undefined, and he addressed it by making sure the zone was set to nil when queuing embedded Ansible. He made a change to ensure the playbook run only happens on appliances with the automate role, and he made a change to ensure work is completed only in the zone where the server has assigned the embedded Ansible role. Next slide, please. For enhancements, Libor contributed one to expand the value to a hash, which improves the API report results. It's more readable. Joar contributed to the ongoing improvement of our test infrastructure. And Joe continued to address Ruby upgrade issues. Next slide, please. Some enhancements were made to the embedded Ansible front. Nick L contributed one to set the status when doing a repo sync. And Nick L contributed 3. One to avoid having a hard-coded Ansible runner repo file by instead just downloading the repo file. Another to install any roles defined in a playbook right before the playbook is run. And one to avoid starting Apache for the embedded Ansible role. And Nick C also made a few contributions to embedded Ansible for technical debt. He made a change to not create the local Ansible playbook since we don't currently provide any. And he removed the no longer needed Ansible authentication mixin, and he removed some no longer needed embedded Ansible config items. And that's it for the platform group. On to Alberto. Do we have Alberto?
Thanks, Joe. Yep. So for the API, we have a new enhancement by David H., and that's to expose the tenant groups as a collection. So this was needed by the UI change ownership form for accessing groups of type tenant, which is otherwise not available with the current API groups endpoint. So essentially, this is exposing API tenant groups, and you can query the collection as well as a resource of that. And that's it for the API. Next slide.
Good afternoon, everybody. The big news from QE, from integration tests, this sprint was that our team has moved our execution environments to Python 3.7. So we are not going to be running into the Python 2 deprecation coming in January. We have a couple follow-up PRs removing use of the 6 library and starting to clean up some of the warnings that we're getting from Python 3. But thanks to everybody that participated in that move. Our supporting libraries of Widgetastic Core, Patternfly, RapidAppy, and MIQ version have been or are in the process of being updated to actually drop Python 2 support. So we are full stop moving to Python 3. We did not make a versioned release or tagged release for this sprint because of the move to Python 3. We were unable to review as many test PRs as we would like for a release. So we left that review window open to continue reviewing changes. The other big news is that we have a new first level reviewer. Parth Vivala is now doing some reviews for us and has the big green button to approve reviews for us. So thanks, everybody.
Okay, Mike, you get the star for the most excited. So for documentation, Suyog did update this slide, but he's not here to present. So if you have any questions about this, contact him directly. And that's it. So the next sprint review is in August 21st. So we'll see you then.